She has already said it. You heard the words. You just didn't hear what they meant. That is the part that makes this particular kind of missing so costly. Because the phrases we are going to talk about in this video do not arrive with any signal that they matter. They sound like frustration. They sound like a difficult week or a passing mood or a conversation about communication. They sound, in almost every case, like something a man can address tomorrow, or next week, or when the timing is better, and so he does not address it. He files it away. He moves on. And she moves on too, just in a direction he did not see coming. The reason men miss these phrases is not a lack of care. It is a lack of a specific kind of listening, one that goes beneath the content of what is being said and pays attention to what the language itself is doing, what it is signaling, where it is pointing. There is one phrase in particular, one that sounds almost kind, almost reassuring, that is actually the clearest signal that her emotional investment has already landed somewhere else. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which one it is, and you will know all 7. Before a woman makes any visible move, her language changes. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself. But if you know what you are listening for, the shift is already there, and it has been there longer than you realize. This is the piece of female psychology that most relationship advice skips entirely. The focus tends to be on behavior, on what she does, where she goes, how much time she spends away. But behavior is late-stage information. By the time the behavior has changed visibly, the internal transition that drove it has usually been underway for weeks, sometimes longer. Language changes first. Language is where the internal world leaks into the external one, quietly and often without her fully intending it. What researchers who study attachment and emotional bonding have consistently observed is that when a person's primary emotional investment begins to shift, when their attention and care start relocating from one relationship toward another, the linguistic patterns they use in the existing relationship change in predictable ways. The changes are not random. They cluster around specific themes: comparison, distance, uncertainty, and closure. And they tend to appear in a particular sequence, with earlier phrases being softer and more deniable, and later ones carrying more psychological weight. Of course, a single phrase in isolation means very little. One difficult conversation, one moment of frustration, one comment made after a long and draining day. None of these constitute a pattern. What you are looking for is repetition, context, and the specific quality of language that carries these particular fingerprints. When they appear together, in more than one conversation, across a period of time where other things have also subtly shifted, that is when they become meaningful. The mistake most men make when they begin to sense something is wrong is to address the surface content of what was said rather than the underlying signal. She says something that sounds like a complaint, and he responds to the complaint. He misses entirely that the complaint was also a window. Understanding why language changes first sets the foundation. But knowing what the specific changes sound like is an entirely different skill, and it begins with the phrase most men encounter earliest in this process. This one arrives early. It sounds like a complaint about the past, about who you were and who you have become. But the direction it is actually pointing is not backward. It is towards someone she has recently started paying attention to. You never used to be like this. Or some version of it. You've changed. This isn't who I fell for. You used to care more. The particular wording varies, but the structure is always the same. A comparison between a past version of you and a present version, framed as a loss. And on the surface, it is easy to hear this as a legitimate grievance about growth or change or neglect. Sometimes, in isolation, that is exactly what it is, but there is a specific context in which this phrase carries a different meaning. When a woman says some version of, "You never used to be like this," at a point when she has also become less available, less open, and more privately occupied, she is not describing a change in you. She is describing a new internal standard she has recently acquired. something or someone has shown her a different quality of engagement, and she is now experiencing your ordinary behavior as a deficit by comparison. The psychological mechanism here is what attachment researchers describe as contrast activation, the moment when a new emotional reference point makes an existing one feel insufficient, not because the existing one changed, but because the comparison now exists where it did not before. The phrase is the first public evidence of that comparison running in the background. You might be thinking, but she has a point. I have changed. This is a fair criticism. And sometimes it is. The distinction is in how the phrase is delivered and what accompanies it. Genuine concern about drift in a relationship comes with an invitation to reconnect. This phrase, when it signals emotional movement elsewhere, comes with withdrawal. She says it and then closes rather than opens. That distinction matters enormously. The common mistake is to become defensive or to over-apologize and overcorrect, neither of which addresses what the phrase is actually signaling. A man who hears this and doubles down on proving himself has responded to the complaint and missed the window entirely. That phrase points backward as a disguise, but the next phrase points sideways, and it does so in a way that is almost impossible to misinterpret once you understand what it is doing. There is a version of this phrase that every man dreads hearing, and a version that sounds so innocent he lets it pass completely. Both of them mean the same thing. He just gets it. Or, talking to him is just so easy. Or something even softer. It's refreshing to be around someone who really listens. The name may or may not be attached. Sometimes it is a coworker mentioned in passing. Sometimes it is a friend she has known for years but is suddenly referencing more frequently. Sometimes it is no one specific, just a floating he that appears without context and then disappears again before you can ask about it. What a woman is doing when she uses any version of this phrase is not making an observation about another person. She is communicating the precise nature of the emotional gap she is currently experiencing, and she is telling you, indirectly, that the gap is being filled somewhere else. The he is not the story. The gap is the story. Psychologists who study emotional infidelity, which is the development of deep emotional intimacy with someone outside a primary relationship, note that language about third parties is one of the earliest and most reliable behavioral markers. It appears before physical distance, before reduced communication, and long before any explicit acknowledgement of a problem. The woman is not announcing an affair. She is describing an emotional experience that has become significant enough to mention, which means it has already crossed a threshold of personal importance. Now you might be thinking, she mentions people all the time, this could be anyone. And that is fair. The signal is not in the mention alone. It is in the combination. The mention, plus the comparison quality of the language, plus the timing relative to other small withdrawals you may already have noticed. One instance means relatively little. A pattern means everything. The mistake men make here is to respond to the named person, to become focused on who he is, whether to ask questions, whether to feel threatened by someone specific. That response addresses the symptom and completely bypasses the actual signal, which is about the emotional gap and where she is going to fill it. That phrase names the comparison openly, but the next one is more dangerous precisely because it does not name anyone at all, and it arrives in a moment when a man is most likely to dismiss it entirely. This phrase sounds like a request. It sounds like she is asking for something reasonable: time, room, the chance to sort through something complicated. But by the time a woman says this to a man she is in a relationship with, the sorting has already been done. I just need some space to think. Or, I need time to figure out what I'm feeling. Or more gently, I feel like I need a little room right now. The request seems legitimate on its face. Relationships go through difficult periods. People do sometimes need time to process. Asking for space is a normal and healthy thing in many contexts. But there is a quality to this phrase that distinguishes it from a genuine request for reflection, and it is the quality of what it closes rather than what it opens. A woman who genuinely needs time to process her feelings in a relationship that matters to her will typically couple that request with some form of emotional tether. She might say, "I need space, but I'm not going anywhere." She might ask for a specific amount of time. She might express confusion that includes him, confusion about the relationship, about what they both want, about how to make things better. The space phrase as an emotional transition signal does none of these things. It is clean. It is final in its tone, even when it is not final in its words. It creates distance without any corresponding gesture toward closing that distance later. What she is managing in that moment is not confusion. She is managing the gap between a decision she has already reached internally and the external reality she has not yet rearranged to match it. The mistake men make here is to give the space she asked for, while interpreting the request as a sign of continued engagement. He respects her need, gives her room, and waits. But the waiting is not what she needed from him, and by the time he realizes that, the window for a different kind of response has already passed. If that phrase signals that the transition is already underway internally, then the next phrase signals something slightly different, that she has begun preparing the external conditions for it, quietly and methodically. Everyone is busy, that is true. But there is a particular quality to the busyness of a woman who is redirecting her attention, and it has a very specific pattern when you look at when it started and what it replaced. "I've just been really busy lately" is not always a signal of anything other than a demanding week. But when it becomes a consistent explanation, when it appears repeatedly in response to invitations, to reaching out, to plans that once required no justification, it is shifted from description to management. She is not describing her schedule. She is managing your access to her time and attention. The detail worth paying attention to is not the busyness itself, but the specificity of when it began. A woman who was previously available, who answered quickly, who made time, who was present in the small daily rhythms of your shared life, and who has now become consistently unavailable across multiple weeks and contexts, has not simply become busier. Her time is the same. What she is doing with it has changed. Remember what I told you at the beginning of this video, that there is one phrase most men hear and dismiss entirely, one that sounds like the opposite of a warning. We are getting close to it now. But before we arrive there, the next two phrases carry something equally important, and they tend to appear almost in sequence. The mistake men make when they encounter the busyness phrase is to accept it at face value and increase their own patience. He tells himself she is going through something difficult, that this is temporary, that the right response is to be understanding and wait. And in doing so, he inadvertently confirms to her that the space she is quietly creating is available to her without cost. The busyness phrase covers her time, but the next phrase covers something more intimate, and it arrives in a very specific kind of conversation that men consistently fail to read correctly. Uncertainty is one of the most misread states in relationship dynamics, because when a woman says she does not know what she wants, most men hear an invitation to make their case. What she is actually doing is something very different. "I don't know what I want right now" sounds like openness. It sounds like a door left ajar, as if the situation is still fluid, as if the right words or the right gesture could shift the balance. And men, understandably, respond to it as though it were a problem they could solve with sufficient effort or clarity or patience. But genuine uncertainty invites. It asks questions. It expresses confusion about both people, not just about herself. The uncertainty phrase in this context does none of that. It is a statement, not a question. It communicates something specific while appearing to communicate nothing. What it is actually saying is, "I have made a decision, but I am not ready to deliver it yet, and this phrase is what I am using to hold the space between what I have already decided and what I have not yet said out loud." The psychological function here is what some relationship researchers call protective ambiguity. The use of open-ended language to maintain relational holding patterns while a transition is being finalized internally. It protects her from having a direct confrontation before she is ready. It protects him, in her mind, from a hurt she is not yet prepared to cause. And it keeps the external structure of the relationship nominally intact, while the internal structure has already shifted. You might object here. Surely sometimes women genuinely don't know what they want. And of course, that is true. The qualifier that separates genuine confusion from protective ambiguity is this. Genuine confusion comes with engagement. It comes with trying to figure it out together. The uncertainty phrase, as a signal, comes with continued emotional withdrawal even as the words suggest openness. She says she does not know while becoming less present, less warm, and less invested in anything that would require her to stay. The mistake is to respond with reassurance, with evidence of commitment, with a case for why the relationship is worth continuing. That response treats the phrase as though it were a real question, when it is actually a managed statement with the answer already written. That phrase manages his expectations. But the sixth phrase manages something else entirely. And it is the one that most clearly signals not just emotional movement, but the active construction of an exit. By the time she says this, she has already made the argument to herself 100 times. She has tried it on, tested it, refined it. What you are hearing is not a thought she is having for the first time. It is the version she finally decided was ready to say out loud. I just feel like we want different things. Or, I think we're looking for different things in life. Or stated even more gently, I'm not sure we're in the same place anymore. The language of divergent values, of incompatible futures, of paths that do not align. And unlike the earlier phrases, this one does not invite repair. It frames the problem as structural, as a mismatch between two people rather than a solvable issue between them. This is the language of a closing argument because that is precisely what it is. A woman who has been quietly running a comparison between her existing relationship and the emotional experience available to her elsewhere will eventually arrive at a narrative that explains the transition in terms she can live with. Terms that make it feel not like a choice she is making, but like a reality she is acknowledging. We want different things, is that narrative, distilled and delivered. The specific framing matters. When a woman uses values divergence language, she is not inviting you to prove that you want the same things. She is presenting a conclusion as though it were an observation. And the particular danger of this phrase is that it sounds reasonable. It sounds like something two adults can hear and accept. It does not sound like what it actually is. The last step before a decision becomes a statement. Of course, sometimes two people genuinely do want different things, and that recognition is legitimate and important. The signal here is in the timing and the context. This phrase appearing after several of the phrases we have already covered, during a period of sustained emotional withdrawal, is not a new realization. It is the final piece of a narrative that has been under construction for some time. The mistake men make is to argue with the content, to try to demonstrate alignment, to reference shared plans or shared values, to make the case that the divergence she is describing is not real. That response engages the argument while missing that the argument was never really the point. Every phrase we have covered so far arrives in the middle of the transition, but the seventh phrase is different, because it arrives at the end of something, and most men hear it as a beginning. This one sounds like the opposite of a warning. It sounds like something good. It sounds like she is telling you that you matter to her, and you do. But not in the way you are hoping, and not for the reason you think. I really do care about you. Or, you mean so much to me. Or delivered in its softest form, I don't want to hurt you, you know that. These phrases arrive with warmth in the voice and genuine emotion in the delivery. And that warmth is real. She is not being dishonest. She does care about you. The problem is what the care is doing in that sentence. Because its function is not to reinforce a bond. Its function is to soften a departure. This is what psychologists who study relationship dissolution describe as pre-exit affiliative signaling. the expression of care and positive regard immediately before or during the process of emotional withdrawal. It is the language a woman uses when she has already made her decision and is now focused primarily on how that decision lands. She does not want to cause unnecessary pain. She wants you to know that the transition she is making does not erase what you shared. And she is managing her own feelings too, because leaving someone she genuinely cares about is not emotionally neutral, even when she is certain about the direction she is moving. The reason this is the most overlooked phrase of all 7 is because it produces the exact opposite of alarm in the man who hears it. He feels reassured. He hears the warmth. He focuses on the care she is expressing and concludes that the relationship has a foundation worth returning to. He exhales. And in exhaling, he releases the last moment when a different kind of response might have mattered. That is the moment. Right there, in the warmth of that phrase, when the ground has already shifted, and he is standing on it as though it is still solid. All 7 phrases taken together tell a single story. It is the story of an internal transition that moves through a woman's psychology in a predictable direction. From comparison to distance, from distance to uncertainty, from uncertainty to narrative, from narrative to closure. The language arrives in that order, and each phrase on its own sounds manageable. The pattern is what carries the weight. The overarching truth is this: a woman's emotional world moves before her behavior does, and language is the bridge between the two. The phrases we covered today are not the transition. They are the evidence of a transition already underway, which means the window for a different outcome is earlier than most men think, and it is not found in responding to what she says. It is found in understanding what the language is doing before it closes. You now have something most men never get, not a list of warning signs to monitor with anxiety, but a genuine understanding of how emotional withdrawal actually sounds in language. That understanding changes your orientation to these conversations entirely. You are no longer a man who hears the words. You are a man who understands what they carry. You do not need to approach every difficult conversation as a diagnostic. You do not need to analyze every phrase for hidden meaning. What you need is to be present enough and fluent enough in this particular language to recognize the pattern when it arrives, and to respond to what is actually happening rather than only to what was said. Drop the number in the comments. Which of these 7 phrases have you heard? Just the number. You don't have to say anything else. If this gave you a new level of clarity about how women communicate in the moments that matter most, subscribe. On this channel, we go beneath the surface of female psychology, and we stay there. Not to give you tactics, but to give you genuine understanding that changes how you see and navigate these dynamics. In the next video, I am going to show you the 3 behavioral changes that follow these phrases when the shift has become irreversible, and the one window that closes permanently if a man doesn't recognize it in time.